Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar about how to integrate payments testing into your Agile DevOps process so you can accelerate your digital transformation. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please watch the chat as we're going through today's webinar. You will see posts there from our team about different pieces of content and information that you might find useful today. Also, that's where you can contact us if you have a problem during today's session. Today's session will be recorded, so you'll be able to view it offline, and we will be doing a Q&A session at the end. So please also check out the questions panel there within the control panel for the webinar and add questions as we go. We may answer some during the webinar via the live chat, but we'll be kind of keeping the majority of those to the end of the session today. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I am Mark Lambert. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Parasoft, and I've been working in the software quality, security, and compliance space for a little over 16 years. I'm joined by Steve Gildy today, Director of Market Engagement. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure, Director of Market Engagement at Paragon Application Systems, focused on the payments testing domain. And happy to be here today, Mark.
Great, and happy to be with you as well, Steve. Steve and I have been talking a lot over the last year or so, and really today's culmination is today's presentation is the culmination of that conversation. So just a little bit of background, because I know we have a mixed audience, some folks that are familiar with Parasoft, some folks that are familiar with Paragon. So let's kind of like lay the scene here. So Parasoft is a software quality, security, and compliance organization. We are a tools vendor focused on providing a continuous quality suite to our clients, meaning that we enable you to build quality into your software delivery process from when the first line of code is created, all the way through testing and validation at the unit, API, and UI level. We were founded in '87. We're based in Los Angeles, and we're a recognized leader in the industry. Specifically, we're recognized as a visionary within Gartner's Magic Quadrant, as well as actually for Gartner being a Customer's Choice Award for 2019 and 2020. And then we've actually been a leader in Forrester's Functional Test Automation Wave for the last 4 consecutive waves. We focus on software quality across many different industry areas. And when we're talking about our financial clients, payments is at the heart of all of their customer experiences. And this is why we've partnered with Paragon. Paragon is a very similar organization to ourselves, focused on a specific area. We are solely focused on software quality. They're solely focused on payments testing solutions. We're both privately held. We both have a lot of joint clients leveraging our technology stacks. So we've come together here to show you how you can integrate payments testing, which is typically a siloed activity, into your broader end-to-end testing strategy, focusing on mobile, web UI, APIs, and that's where I'll kind of like dig in a little deeper. But at this point, I'd like to hand over to you, Steve, so you can talk about what's going on in the payments industry and kind of why this integration is important.
Terrific. We'll just bring the deck up there, and can you confirm you can see me, Mark?
Yes, indeed, we can see.
Great. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the audience today. Even as we finally begin to recover from the COVID hangover, there is tremendous pressure for us to get back to business as usual. I'm guessing that many of you already have 2021 business plans that are very aggressive and may look something like this. And you're probably asking yourself, how do you get everything done? Unfortunately, there really is no going back to what we considered normal before COVID hit. The world is a fundamentally different place, and it is going to require that we do even better than we did before. And that's where testing automation comes in. Forrester says that automation is now a business imperative, and if you don't automate your business, you may not even survive. And to be sure, things are not going to slow down. They are only going to continue to accelerate. At the same time, it's getting harder and harder to stay ahead of the competition. You may have seen some of these comments made by Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, in his 2021 shareholder letter. The letter clearly highlights several fintech and big tech organizations that have become or will become Chase's biggest competitors. In fact, in many ways, the competition is already well ahead of most financial institutions. And one of the key reasons for this is the speed at which fintech and big tech organizations operate. This chart helps to illustrate how quickly some of these companies deploy innovative changes into their environments. The capacity for speed is based largely on their use of automation. The growing speed differential means that many organizations will fall farther and farther behind. For most financial institutions, testing represents a significant portion of their IT budget and their overall development process. Unfortunately, it also represents a significant barrier to success. To further complicate matters, too much testing is still done manually. In a recent survey conducted by Capgemini, respondents indicated that only about 15% of testing was currently automated. And this is especially true when it comes to the payment channels. Gartner also highlights the need for testing automation and states everything that can be automated should be automated. They clearly point out that automation is a key requirement in improving efficiency and reducing costs. We certainly believe that automating your payments testing environment will deliver a number of benefits, including increased test coverage and improved quality, shorter project delivery cycles and faster time to market, optimization of resources, as well as reduced costs and additional opportunities for integration, which is what we're going to talk about in more detail later today. Unfortunately, many organizations indicate that the number one reason that they cannot automate more of their testing is the very same reason that they need to automate more of their testing, and that is the speed at which things are changing. That means it's time for some alternative thinking. We often advise clients that the most important step toward meeting your testing and automation goals is the first step. Just get started. No matter where you are on the automation or on your automation or DevOps journey, a tool like WebFast Test can be used to automate your most common payment testing processes, and it is never too early or too late to get started. At this point, I'm going to run just through a brief tour of the WebFast Test platform and introduce it to you, and then Mark is going to get into more detail about how the two products work together. So WebFast is a payment testing solution that enables automation of functional regression and performance testing, provides centralized control of all your user and test data, facilitates 24/7 remote access to the system via a simple browser. In this particular instance, this instance of the product is running in the Azure cloud. Before we get started, I want to just take a look at the roles that we're working with today. So I am set up as a system administrator, and I have all sorts of roles and responsibilities that I can perform for my group. And Mark is set up as a tester, a much more focused role, primarily interested in executing tests rather than creating or modifying them. Of course, in order to run tests, we need to have test cards, and you can put test cards into the system in a number of different ways. You can import them from a file, you can import them directly from cards using a physical card reader, or you can create them on your own. And it's a pretty straightforward process. You have total flexibility over the data elements, and you can see here from the EMV data that we support all of the specific EMV tags for current transaction processing. For each of the formats that are accessible into the WebFast Test platform, we provide a complete set of messages that are relevant to that particular format. And you can see here, this is a Visa SMS test format. I've got all of the messages that you would need to support transaction processing for Visa SMS. One interesting thing about what we provide here is you have total flexibility to edit, modify, copy, change the data elements all the way down to the individual field levels. Of course, the messages get used to build transactions, and here we've got a small set of transactions that we're going to be working with today. So you can see a transaction set up here and the messages that make up the transaction. This is a reversal, so it's got additional messages. Transactions can be set up to use specific cards or connections, or they can be modified at runtime. You can override fields at runtime. You can schedule tests to run at specific time if you want, or you can start a test now, which is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start a test. And just that simple, the test has been completed. And it allows me to see the complete exchange of outbound and inbound messages back and forth between the authorizing host, including all the EMV tags. In addition to transactions, we can set up transaction sets. This is especially important if you want to do regression testing, if you want to do performance testing, you want to set up groups of transactions. And of course, we have a small segment here, but there's no limit on the number of transactions that you can set up in the system. And as I mentioned before, you can run and pre-configure your test sets, or you can modify specific aspects of the set. You can remove transactions from a run if you want, or simply run everything you've got. And of course, you can schedule or run the tests right now. Finally, we have a complete set of results history that's accessible by the users. You can search, you can find, you can filter transactions any way that you want to filter them. You can also pick transactions and compare them. And we would show you all of the data elements associated with the transactions, why one ran, why one didn't run, and all that information is available and stored as long as you want it to be stored. So while WebFast is a fully functional and self-contained platform for testing payment transactions on its own, we recognize the importance of integrating our environment with other enterprise systems like the systems that Parasoft offers. So once all the cards and messages and transactions are configured and set up in the WebFast user interface, they can be managed and run from external systems like SOATest. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to Mark, who's going to illustrate how that works. So Mark, over to you.
Great, thank you, Steve. Let me get my camera on that. Great. Okay, so now we've done, or we created tests that are validating some of our card payments. We're validating ADM transactions. The question now is, how do we integrate that into our broader Agile DevOps testing practices, into our Agile DevOps pipelines and our broader enterprise testing strategy? So we're going to talk about three sets of things. We're going to do a brief product tour as to show you how to achieve these. We're going to talk about how to integrate what Steve showed you into your test orchestration from SOATest. We're going to show how to data drive so we can expand coverage, and then how to integrate that into CI/CD as well as the rest of your overall test infrastructure. So before we step in though, let's talk about that bigger picture. So the challenge that we are facing in the industry is the acceleration that many organizations have adopted to keep up in the market and to get feedback is driving very complex testing requirements. You have multiple interfaces and multiple components that are changing within those interfaces. The question is, how do I test this? What we see in many organizations are siloed tooling that starts to appear, specific techniques and technologies for testing a specific human or non-human interface. And when we start talking about payment testing, we're introducing an additional layer into that. And typically it's something that most organizations treat in a siloed activity rather than trying to understand how it fits into the broader context, which obviously leaves organizations open to risk. So what we can do with these technologies is actually combine them together. Now, obviously, what we're going to do here is we're going to be leveraging WebFast Test from Paragon to exercise and test those payments and ATM transactions. What we do is we bring that into an orchestrated test execution with Parasoft SOATest. So Parasoft SOATest is the industry-leading API testing technology. It really is a Swiss Army knife for doing everything that you need to be able to do for API testing, not just RESTful or SOAP-based services that we'll talk about today, but all of the detailed kind of back-end systems like JMS or MQ-based protocols, fixed messaging, Swift messaging, things like that. What we can do within SOATest is we can orchestrate not just APIs, but also front-end UIs. So we can test mobile applications through integrations with Appium. We can test web through native functionality within SOATest or by integrating in your existing Selenium tests. We can access APIs. We'll see a lot of that today, access databases. And then what we're also going to be focusing on today is how we can integrate execution of WebFast Test into that same orchestrated workflow. This gives us the ability to do an end-to-end workflow. It gives us the ability to really kind of thoroughly test our broader testing initiatives, and we can reuse those tests for non-functional testing activities like performance testing and security. But once we've tested and figured out how to test the front end, we need to think about how we can not only automate these, but run them continuously. And the biggest problem that we see that organizations face when they're trying to move from automated to continuous test automation is the back-end system dependencies. And those can be unavailable or uncontrollable for many different reasons. Maybe it's a third-party system that has a feed-based access approach to a test environment. Maybe it's an internally deployed microservices container, but I can stand it up, but I can't actually get it to behave the way that I want because of data requirements or functional characteristics that I'm trying to validate within my test case. Maybe I'm working with parallel executions with individual teams, and we're waiting for somebody else to be finished implementing something before we can move forward with our testing. Or maybe I'm trying to do early stage performance testing and that backend system becomes a bottleneck. The list goes on. What we can do with Parasoft Virtualize, which is our service virtualization technology, is we're able to emulate the behavior, the performance characteristics, and the data that is coming from those backend systems by using simulations of the interactions, going beyond a simple mock and building in complex business logic, but doing it in a way that you have a disposable, fully controllable backend system. When we tie that together with test data, we're able to really start controlling the full test environment, and we can package this into a thin client environment that gives us the ability to give testers the full control over their test environment so that they can manage and use that for their own purposes. But we can also leverage that test environment as a template that we stamp out into our CI/CD pipeline. So Parasoft technologies are all designed to plug into your CI/CD pipeline to provide immediate feedback based upon commits, based upon different stages of your development process. And this is where we can start to leverage the service virtualization and API testing together to stamp out different disposable test environments based upon your requirements at the different stages of the pipeline. And then this information is all aggregated into a centralized reporting and analytics dashboard. This dashboard is actually taking data from across the pipeline and from across the Parasoft stack, as well as integrations with other third parties, to give a centralized view of quality, security, and compliance. This really is the key component that brings together integration into your entire DevOps ecosystem. We're taking data from the testing practices that are in your CI/CD pipeline. We're aggregating those into a centralized location, and then we are actually using that data that's aggregated and correlating that information with the originating artifacts. So for example, user stories in Jira, and I'll demonstrate and I'll show you a brief overview of Jira today. We can leverage the integrations and associations of test artifacts with the user stories to control the state of those artifacts in the original system in Jira. We can then also leverage those user stories or requirements to provide traceability reporting within our reporting and analytics dashboard. And then as you see problems occur, which you will see test failures, you can leverage the thin client reporting and analytics dashboard to really validate the details of a test failure and then create a defect or issue within the system of record, a task in essence for the team to go ahead and work on. So this is kind of how it all plugs together. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to do a very brief product tour the same way that Steve just did. And I'm going to show you how these things all kind of work together. Now, we're time constrained during a webinar, and obviously we're trying to touch upon all of the elements today. So as I go through this, if you would like a more in-depth demonstration or a technical deep dive with our team, please feel free to reach out to us at info@parasoft.com. You'll see some additional call to actions at the end of the session today as well, which can be used as follow-on information. So there are going to be 5 things that I'm going to show you briefly today. First of all, I'm going to show you how we can integrate the payments testing into the existing testing workflow. So I'll take something that's already in SOA test, and I'm going to integrate Web Fast Test into that. I'm then also going to show how we can leverage that integration with Web Fast Test to data drive, parameterize, and driving test coverage for my payments testing. We're going to see how we can then take that test and execute it as part of a CI/CD pipeline. We'll use Azure DevOps today. And then we're going to talk about how we can take the data from that pipeline, get it into a centralized reporting and analytics dashboard for visibility, and correlate it with user stories. And then last but not least, we'll show a very brief example as to how we can leverage service virtualization to help us test an environment or a situation where we don't have the ability to perform the test execution. So with that being said, let me introduce you to our demonstration application. So we're going to use a fictitious banking organization called Parabank. This is actually publicly available. If you were to go to parabank.parasoft.com, you will actually come across a similar instance to this. I can log in, and then when I log in, I can actually see that I've got some bank accounts, and I can kind of manipulate these as required. I can do loan requests, things like that. I can do go to my account overview and look at transactions in there. Now, this is obviously a web UI, but there's an API that sits behind this, and actually the environment that sits behind this, we actually can graphically draw out within our continuous testing platform. This is really the centralized hub for where I can manage my test ecosystem. And if I just expand out my test environment here, this is a diagram of what this test environment looks like. You can see I've got SOA test and web fast test inside of this architecture. You can also see I've got numerous other components, and then I can actually interact with this diagram to perform different actions. We're going to come back to this. We're actually going to come back to a different example as well when we talk about service virtualization, where I'm going to kind of manipulate some of the backend system dependencies. But now let's actually switch and say, okay, how do I start to create my tests for validating this environment? And this is where we're going to switch to the desktop environment of Parasoft SOA test. Desktop environment of Parasoft SOA test is an Eclipse-based environment, but don't worry, you don't have to learn code. It's all a codeless UI-driven interface. We have a number of projects here on the left-hand side, and you can see that I'm doing different things. Like in this case, I'm doing some SOAP calls. You're going to see some REST calls later. You'll see some banking calls as well. Each of these represent individual test steps. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start to integrate with web fast test. And the first way that I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to create a new test file by actually leveraging, we're going to call this web fast test example. I'm going to put it in my test assets folder. And we're going to leverage the web services documentation that is provided with your Paragon web fast server. So we're actually going to leverage that description. This is also how we can interface with other ecosystems. So we're able to interrogate an OpenAPI Swagger document or RAML. There's a bunch of infrastructure type of things that we can connect to. We can even process traffic to create API tests from traffic. And leverage our AI machine learning to be able to create meaningful test scenarios from recorded interactions. But here what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to leverage the web services or the WSDL file that comes with Paragon Edge. And here I'm going to go ahead and actually I have it, you can see I've actually already done it once before. I'm going to create some functional test cases. What this will do is this will interrogate the WSDL file, and it will take that description, so that web service description language, it will take that description and create me a number of artifacts that I can reuse to interrogate that service. Now, we can actually test or generate both Java clients as well as .NET WCF clients. The web fast test API is written in WCF, but for the purposes of this integration, it doesn't matter, so we'll use the Java clients. And I'll just go ahead and click finish. And what happened is some magic just happened. It went to that server, it interrogated the web services description file, and then it created me a test, set of test artifacts here based upon that. You can see we've got a couple of different versions of the API that are available to us, some basic HTTP, some custom secure bindings. I'm actually going to just use the basic HTTP one today. And we can see here are all of the operations that are available to us for the purpose of doing our execution of those artifacts that sat within Web Fast Test. So let's actually do that. Let's go ahead and quickly go back to what Steve showed us. Let's go to Web Fast Test. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here. And I'm actually going to go to that results history view. This was exactly the same instance that Steve just showed us. And I can actually see here, I think this is the one you just did, Steve. If I click on this, you can see all of that goodness that Steve showed us earlier. All of these input and output values, and we're going to see this data again when we do the execution within SOA test. But the thing that I want to highlight right now is this API command here. This is the API command that you would use to be able to execute this, and these are the values that we want to put inside of our API call going to the Web Fast Test API. So if I go ahead and kind of look at the individual things. So here we're executing a start test function. So here, obviously, you can see we've got a start test service. When I open up that, we can see that there's some attributes here. I can go ahead and edit these, and we get a UI-driven view onto the parameters that you're going to want to set up as part of your test execution. So I've got username and password, so we can go ahead and add the values in here, right? I've got the all of the parameters associated with the test execution itself. I can do card override, field overrides. I can go ahead and set my profile name, so on and so forth. Now, there are quite a few parameters that I would set up here, so I don't want to spend a lot of time copying and pasting. So I have actually prepared one earlier. So let's just go ahead and close that guy. And this example test project is available. We can share it with you guys as we start going through kind of an integration between the two products. But you can see here I've got a number of example scenarios. My first one, quite simply, does exactly what we were just looking at. So here you can see that I've got my username and password. These are actually environment variables. So here within my environment variables view, I have some variables which are appropriate, my endpoint, my WSDL endpoint, my username, my token that I've actually masked in the test case here. We can also see that I've got a number of other fields that I filled in. I filled in my profile name, group, etc. I've got my selected terminals, which is some key value pairs that are also filled in here as well. Now, when you execute a test, that's great, but you also need to be able to get the results. And this is an asynchronous service. So you're going to execute the test, and then you're going to get the results at a later point. So I should say it's a synchronous service, but there's an asynchronous behavior to get the test results. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and run this test, and quite literally you should say, yep, 2 tests have run, 2 tests have succeeded. So let's talk through what we're looking at here. You'll see that we have this thing called a traffic viewer. And if I click on that, this is where I can see the payloads that went to the service, the request. Let's go ahead and hide the header. And I can see the response. And you might go, okay, that's a whole bunch of scary XML. Well, don't worry, we actually have a much simplified view here that gives us the ability to very just hone in on what the values are. Start test, as I said, obviously initiates the test with the appropriate values that we set in the UI earlier. But the response is just saying, okay, great, here's the test, here's the result. It doesn't actually give you the data of the results. For that, we want to leverage this get results call that I've also put into this example. So for us to do that, what we want to do is we want to say, I need to take this GUID and leverage that in get results. Here, what we can do, and this is one of the really cool things about Parasoft SOA test, is I'm still using the same username, password, token, again from the environment. But when I take my get results, there's actually a value, the test GUID that I need to return. And I actually pulled that from the prior test. So these two are actually chained together. So here I actually, if I was to use data source wizard, I could actually do the same thing. I can say, okay, I'm going to extract that value. maybe the scheme is this, maybe I needed the scheme, so I could extract those things or the result code. It's a very easy UI-driven approach to be able to, in essence, chain 2 steps together. In doing that, I now have traffic from my test, because if I look at my request, you can see I passed that same GUID along, same username, password, and then here you've got the results that have come back from get results. Now you can see there's a lot of data in here, and the question in your mind is like, okay, so how do I know if that was successful? This is where we can build assertions and targeted assertions within the tests. So a same way that I extracted the data using XML or XPath here previously, here I can also apply a number of assertions, and we have added some default assertions as part of this test. So I'm saying, okay, in the response, my error count should be 0, or it should actually have a value of no errors. So let's actually go look here. So these are actually the assertions. So I called it no errors. My expected value of that parameter is 0. I can go ahead and actually, let's just go ahead and I can go ahead and actually show you how you would do that. So I can actually add a value assertion, and I get the same graphical view, and I can say, you know what, I want to extract this value, so let's extract card name. And when I do that, I can actually build an assertion saying, based on its expected value, I can also actually interrogate and see, okay, what was that value that was in this example payload? So here I've got a very simple 2-step process. I've integrated it into SOATest. It was very quick to do that. I've got the API data in Web Fast Test. How can I now reuse that in an existing test scenario? So here I have another test scenario that I've been building, and it says, okay, I'm going to log into an account. I'm going to get the account. I'm then going to actually just delete that because that was the thing I tested earlier. I then want to test the payment, and then I want to make a REST call to make sure that the payment transaction was done correctly. And my REST call here is going to say, okay, I'm looking to see that a transaction in my transaction log is called payment. And that's the thing that we'll use to verify that we're working correctly. So what I can do quite simply is copy and paste and say, okay, let's go ahead, and now we're going to reuse those elements. I actually already have the appropriate environment variables already injected into my environment instance here. But let's go ahead and just close all my windows. Don't save that. And then I can go ahead and run. And now what I'm doing is I'm actually pulling out, I'm running that test in sequence with a set of REST calls that are happening as well. So I've got a REST call that's being made to a service to pull back the account numbers. And then making another call down here to say, okay, interrogate a particular account, and then I'm going to see what the value of that is. So I apply my assertions. Now you can also see that we've got a failure here because the value that I got from my transactions was expecting to be payment, but was actually written as debit. This shows the problem that we had in this particular use case, and we want to start seeing problems because it's going to be the easier way to kind of show how this is going to identify potential regressions. If I wanted to assert on a particular value that came from get results, for example, I could actually leverage an extraction utility. So I can actually extract from my response from the SOAP envelope. This is a SOAP service, so it's XML, but we support REST and JSON as well. And I can extract a data value from my service, again, selecting a particular field. And if we want to go ahead and modify, I can actually do the evaluation. And then I can actually further customize this too. There's some examples in here. I'm not going to go into all of them today, but we have some data extraction examples where we can actually kind of show you how the details of that. So I'll just run that just in case some questions come up about that later. So don't save. Okay. All right. So what I've done is there we go. Okay, so I've injected the results into my test scenario. As I said, I could use the XML data bank, and then I could actually make my assertion driven by a particular value as well. So the same kind of parameterization that we saw earlier is exactly what we can do here. Now, one thing that we want to be able to do, though, is we want to be able to associate this test with a user story or a requirement in our system of record. And that's going to be critical for us to know that when we have a test failure, we know what it's associated with. And that's very straightforward to do within Parasoft SOA test. So here I have a view on the right-hand side where I've actually pulled a series of user stories from Jira through our DTP platform. You can see that there are a number of user stories that have this red or yellow triangle. This indicates that these user stories have no tests associated with them yet. You see that we have some that actually do, and I can actually double click on this guy. It will actually open up the particular test that's associated with that user story. But what I want to do now is say, okay, this test scenario that I just ran, this is associated with this guy up here. ATM transactions should be visible within account transactions. So I'm going to go ahead and say, yep, this guy is associated with this test. Quite simply, drag and drop, and I now have the ability to go straight to that particular test suite. I could attach it also to an individual test step as well, but I can see here that now I've actually associated it with the entire test suite. And we'll see that again when we run the integration with the reporting and analytics. This also is great because I can now see, well, let's go ahead and filter this out. I can see these are all of the tests that I don't, or all of the user stories that I don't have covered today. So there's actually 32 of 46 user stories don't have tests in the test suites that I have within my environment. I can also search it. So if I wanted to say, okay, let's go ahead and find a particular element. So let me just make the UI a little cramped on my screen here for the webinar. But if I was to search for the word loan, or actually transfer, it's probably a better one. We can actually start to see the filtered list. Okay, so I've now built a test. It's got the correct association. I want to start expanding coverage. So I want to start actually data driving this, not just through a single scenario, but across different scenarios and parameterize that with some data sources. Now, I'm going to do that back in this examples that I had here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, so let's say I've got this particular example again, the same one that we used before. So the first thing that I might want to do is to say, okay, I've got a lot of values in here, things that I've set. I want an easy way of extracting these values out and putting them into an external source that I can then modify and expand. So we have a really easy way to do that. I can actually here within the UI generate a data source based upon that parameterized, or those values that we filled in. So I'm actually going to generate a CSV data source here. I'm going to give it a destination. I'm going to put it in test assets. I'm going to call it a different one because I have one already called that. So I'm going to call it 2 and then click OK. Okay, when I do that, you'll see it changes the test now. So everything is parameterized. It's got this little dot next to it. It's parameterized with a data source called test data. Start test data. And that data source is right up here in the test suite. There's a whole bunch of different types of data source that we support. We support CSV, obviously, I'll show you that in a second, Excel, database calls. We also have this internally hosted table, which I'll use in a moment to parameterize in a different way. Okay, so I can also go ahead, if I go to my Project Explorer, you'll see that here's my CSV file. Let's just see if I can open with text editor. This is always interesting on the Mac. Okay, right here, thank you. Put it in the right place. Okay, great. So here's just a simple CSV file. So I could actually add new rows to this and then quite simply just parameterize that test scenario based on that CSV file. We also have an example here which talks about how to run multiple tests so in a data-driven way. So just kind of using this as an example. Here I've not parameterized everything. I've actually only parameterized one small element of it, and that's actually the test itself. So let's go ahead and, where is that guy? It's down here. So I've parameterized the test ID. I can also do overrides, so I could parameterize an override, for example. So if I wanted to change the amount that's going through the transaction, I could do that. We have a data source here set up for that purpose. So here you can see these are the different test IDs. These are the GUIDs that were pulled out of Web Fast Test by looking at the tests. And then here I've put in just kind of like some simple amount of numbers. We can then go ahead and execute this. And when I run this test, it should run 3 times, and we should see, sorry, 6, there'll be 6 tests because obviously there are 2 elements in it. And you'll see I've got a failure, and that failure is actually kind of down here. And it's saying, well, I was expecting that there was no error, but there was actually an error with one of those examples. And if I go and look at my traffic object and look at my response, again, big scary XML payload, but don't worry, we can jump to here. And if I look at this response, this is row 3. I should see it completed with errors here at the bottom, and there's a bunch of details in here. But likewise, if I now switch back to Web Fast Test and I go to my results history, just hit refresh, we should see that here's the failure that I just ran. So these are the 3 tests that we just ran, and this guy right here is the one that failed, and it failed because the actual field does not match the expected. So it failed on an assertion inside of Web Fast Test, and we saw that assertion information propagate up into here into SOA-Test. And SOA-Test generates obviously feedback in the IDE, but we can start to actually orchestrate this as part of a broader CI/CD pipeline. So let's kind of do that briefly. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to upload this test that I've just been creating, Paragon, Parabank test scenarios. I'm going to upload it into that same thin client interface of CTP. So if I go back into the continuous testing platform, here's my environment that we saw a moment ago. I have a thin client UI here that allows me to do a lot of the same type of things that we were just doing for SOAP and REST clients directly within the UI. So you can see I've got a number of TST files. I'm going to go ahead and upload that file. Let me kind of just move the UIs around a little bit. Let's go ahead and drag and drop that. And I'm going to upload that to the server. Okay. Now I have a test. My TST file is uploaded to the thin client ecosystem. It's up and available. I can hit execute here independently of my desktop, and it's now in an area where people can collaborate, and it would go ahead and do the execution and integration with Web Fast Test. But what I want to do is I actually want to integrate this into a job, something that we can call and schedule as part of our CI/CD pipeline. So here I've got a job that I've defined called E2E payments test. I have a couple of tests already in there. I'm going to add a new test scenario, and that was this one right here, the guy that we just added. So now I've got 3 test scenarios. I'm going to click save. Okay. Again, I could execute here. There's a number of different things that we can do, but what I'm going to show you is how we can actually trigger this execution from within an Azure DevOps pipeline. So here's my Azure DevOps ecosystem. Okay, I've got a very, very simple pipeline. I'm going to go ahead and actually just edit this so you can see it. This is quite literally the standard YAML file that you get just with 2 modules added to it. And these are Parasoft modules that are available directly within Azure DevOps. We have similar integrations with Jenkins, GitHub, GitLab is in progress. It'll be available later this year. Bamboo, TeamCity. I think I'm missing one, but I'll probably remember later. You can see here that you can go in and actually customize and then add, but I've already added this. I'm attaching it to my my CTP machine, which is the test environment. I'm also attaching it to my DTP server, which is the place where I do publishing of reports. So let's go ahead and actually get rid of the task. And I'm just going to go ahead and run this. Okay. So make sure it starts, and then it's now queued up. So it's going to be spinning up an instance in the Azure cloud, and then triggering that job. Let's just kind of make sure it starts fine. Okay, so initializing, and then, okay, great. It's running, so we'll come back to this in a moment. But what I'm going to do now is actually show you where the data is going to go. So the data is going to go into Parasoft DTP, which is our reporting and analytics dashboard. Here you can see historical results over time. We actually leverage a build-based paradigm rather than a time-based paradigm, meaning that we're able to aggregate data when you have multiple builds within a day. You really want to separate those out. But then also, if you have testing that spans several days, but it's associated with one build, you can easily aggregate those together. You can also see that we have traceability associated with different user stories. So here's my 46. Remember, I didn't have 44, I had 32, I think it was. So when we finish sending the data, I'm expecting that number to go down. We can see that we're actually able to aggregate by different user stories and say, okay, user stories with failed tests or passing tests. I can also drill down into the details here. So as I drill down into my pipeline or into my test results, I can start to see all of the data associated with particular test executions. I can see particular failures. I can see the data and the assertion failures associated with those test runs. Okay, let's return back to ADO and see if it's finished yet. Yes, it has. That's great. So my job ran, my job failed because I have failing tests. You can see here in the job summary, it says 76.9% tests passed. I can click on that, and I start to get a nice summary of the information related to that particular pipeline. So I can see the different scenarios that it went through. I can see the data. Unfortunately, the Azure DevOps UI is not very friendly to a blown up screen for a webinar, but you can see the details. You can see the high level summary as well here. So let's go ahead and actually go back into that pipeline though. Let's go back into that job. Okay, so actually that was where we were just looking. There we go. I was expecting that chart to appear. I guess it wasn't ready yet. So here's the high level summary of my percentage, my run. You can see the details of everything. If I go a little out, you can actually see the details here within Azure DevOps. But also the run itself is actually storing data. Let me just go back to my pipeline and go to look at that job again. Oh, sorry, I got a little lost for a second. When it executed the test execution, it actually sent the data to both CTP. There's a report there, and this is the same kind of report that you would get just from a command line execution within your CI/CD. You can see the requirements information right here. You can see the different test steps. I can see traffic and all of the details associated with that. And then also the other thing that we can see is that it said it sent the data to DTP. So I can actually click on this guy and see the details within DTP. I can see the different tests that we just ran. Okay, so I can see if I find out, check payment, here's the start test function and what have you, and these guys passed. And then if I was to go back to my dashboard, and if everything worked correctly, and I hit refresh, you should see that I've got new data that appeared today, which is my ADO build ID. And you can see that I actually have only 12 because I didn't upload all of those tests that I had in my IDE. I only uploaded a couple of those, so I got like 12%, 12 of the user stories, or 26% of them covered. So this gives us that traceability, so I can actually click on here and actually go deeper. I can see individual user stories. I can see, let's go ahead and see if we can find that one, which was my payments testing one. Here we go. Here's my payments testing one, and I can actually go into the details for that. See the different test steps that were failing, that were associated with that. So I can actually go in here and I can see that my test that failed. I can also go actually into Jira as well. And if I'd had the integration where we're sending the test status information as well, that would appear here in the test coverage. So one last thing to show. So we've gone through the first 4 steps. We talked about integrating payments testing. I showed you how we're able to leverage the SOAP API of Web Fast Tests to execute test scenarios, get data back into SOATest that we can then use standard parameterization mechanisms to expand the test coverage. I showed how we could integrate easily into Azure DevOps was my example, but we have native plugins for others. And there is a command line execution model as well. So you can actually run natively within the CI/CD infrastructure. We don't actually have to run purely just in the thin client. It's kind of multiple options. Again, don't have time to go into all of the in-depths. We then showed how we could do reporting and aggregation into DTP, our reporting and analytics dashboard, to give you a centralized view and something that you can use for compliance reporting as you're going through network certification. And the last thing that I want to show you is how service virtualization can come into play. So now I'm going to actually just briefly go back to our banking application, our web UI, and I'm going to show you a use case where I'm doing this manually, but the same is true in an automated banner test automation as well. So if I try to request a loan here, I should see that I get an internal error. And in fact, actually, my test automation was doing the same thing, something we didn't touch upon during this very brief overview. But I have a test in here, which is going to go ahead and is my request loan test. If I was just to go ahead and run this guy, he should fail fail because he's not able to get connections to a backend system. It's basically the loan processor is actually unavailable. So here I've got a whole bunch of response codes that are not what I'm expecting. So I kind of see the effect on the UI. I can see the effect through the API, but how do I know what's going on in the test environment? And this is where inside of, again, inside of CTP, inside of the thin client ecosystem, I can actually look at the test environment and immediately see where potential problems are. So I can see my retail services are online. I can see my database is online, but I can also see here that the actual endpoint for the live loan processor is actually offline, and that's not untypical in large complex environments. So what we can do with service virtualization is we can pick from a library of particular assets that we've already created, and we can leverage those to say, okay, let's provision a simulated instance of that environment. Now everything's green. If I go to my web UI, I should see some correct behavior. So let's just go ahead and test this real quick. Bank of not enough. It's actually a data-driven, intelligent use case. So say if I put below $500 in here, you're going to put a large amount. If I put $1,000 in, it should actually say Bank of Always. So it's intelligent. It's behaving differently depending on the input values. And then likewise, if I was to actually switch to my automation now and rerun this, I should get more failures. I should get a couple of, more passes. I should get a couple of failures because I'm actually expecting that a couple of the rows would return true, but they returned false. And I can customize the behavior of the backend system that way. Okay, so that was the last part of what I wanted to show in the tour, and really that was a fire hose. I was intending to just show the highlights. If you'd like to go into any of it in more detail, have more complete conversation, as I said, please feel free to reach out to us. A couple more places where you can find some more information about SOATest and the other types of interfaces that we work with. So with that being said, let's go ahead and look at the questions. I see we've got a few, but we've only got a couple of minutes here, Steve. So let's just try and, let's just try and tackle a few of these. So, okay, okay, this one's interesting because I have shown a lot of thin client stuff. So, is the solution SaaS/cloud? So, obviously, we're talking about two parts of the solution. It's both Paragon as well as Parasoft. So, from a Parasoft perspective, The desktop component obviously it's the feature-rich power user mode. We have the thin client mode that can be deployed within your own infrastructure. So it's not SaaS per se. We have images that are available inside of Azure and AWS marketplaces. So we can fully deploy within cloud environments. It's fully Dockerizable, containerizable within your own infrastructure as well. Or you can kind of deploy within kind of like standard kind of more traditional server modes. Steve, you want to talk about web fast test and how that, how SaaS and cloud apply to that?
Sure, we certainly can deploy into the cloud environments, AWS, Azure as well, or on-prem. We currently don't have a SaaS product offering either, but we can deploy into those environments at individual customer request.
Yeah, we often find that within financial institutions, there's a need for a cloud-based deployment, but frankly, a SaaS-based offering, because of the data and the kind of like APIs that we're working with, doesn't work because you have to get inside of the firewall. So yeah, if you were probably asking that question because you were thinking that you weren't going to be able to use it in your environment, but yeah, it's typically deployed within the firewall. If it's deployed on cloud, then typically it's on a client-managed cloud instance.
Correct.
Okay. How do we integrate UI testing into the flow? SOA test, I mentioned this briefly. SOA test has some native capabilities around web UI testing, where we have a codeless UI workflow. I will say that that's predominantly to be in support of API testing. The challenge with any kind of codeless web UI testing tool is you're always going to run into problems with the HTML, JavaScript, and DOM manipulation. So what we actually recommend is that people integrate in their existing Selenium tests, or use one of our other products, Parasoft Selenic, to help create pure Java-based Selenium tests and integrate those into the workflow. We have a little utility tool that will pass values in and get values back, so we can chain those UI tests into the workflow that way as well. Okay, another one about different type of things. So database testing. Yeah, we support database testing. I didn't show that in these examples. So let me just quickly add a little tool here, not data generator, DB tool. So I can actually add this guy, and basically it's leveraging JDBC drivers to be able to access the database. So you kind of inject your SQL here. We support stored procedures. You can go a number of different ways that way. So sort of standard databases have the JDBC drivers. We also have little tools for things like MongoDB as well. So if you're leveraging a NoSQL data source, you can kind of bring in that data into the same workflow. And what this tool allows you to do is actually execute a query, and then the result set comes back in basically a tabular traffic view. And then you can do the same kind of assertions, data extractions, things like that. So you can, for example, make a database call, extract a value, pass it to a REST API, and then make another database call to validate that the database changed. That kind of workflow works for database testing. Okay. I think we've got time for a couple more. Just kind of looking for the ones which would be kind of most interesting, I think. Can the pipeline be triggered on commit? Yes. SOA test has, because it's integrated into Eclipse, it actually has a native integration with source control. So things like the predominant ones that we work with, Git, Subversion, Mercurial, are the three primary source control systems. You check that in, and then really that same workflow pipeline that I just showed you, you just set that to trigger based on commit. And actually, that's often one of our preferred routes for working with TST files, is actually having your thin client ecosystem pulling the data from the source control. So it's pulling the test files from source control. This workstation view here also is using source control, and CI/CD is. Source control then becomes a single unified place of truth. You can do versioning. The files are all stored in XML format, so you have the ability to do easier versioning that way as well. Okay, so I think I've kind of talked to a couple of the other points that are in here too. So I think we're good. I think your closing remarks. Thank you very much for joining us today. As I mentioned, there are some resources here for you to learn more information about SOA test, contact us if you'd like to in any more detail. But then also follow us on social as well. So there's a number of different areas that we can do. Obviously, at Paragon Edge as well, being the Twitter handle for Paragon. Any closing remarks from yourself, Steve?
No, thank you very much, Mark, for allowing us to participate today. I think this is clearly the direction the marketplace is taking. Integration and automation are just going to be, it's going to be the only way that organizations are going to be able to keep up with the pace of change. And we're excited about the opportunity to talk to anybody about it. So thanks again.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Steve. And yep, thank you everybody for joining this. As I said, this recording will be available for offline sharing. Please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-on questions. With that being said, have a great day. Thank you again, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.